ahead and lay out the quilt and decide where the colored parts of the binding will go. I started by roughly laying out the binding where I think the color would look good. After looking at it laid out, I didn't love how the blue part of the binding lined up with the blue block, so I shifted the binding about 18 inches. The other thing that is super important to make sure is that your binding strip seams don't overlap the corner of your quilt, or the thickness of the double fabric will give you a bad time. So we'll go ahead and shift things again. And before we go ahead and start sewing on the binding, I like to pin down my start point while everything is all laid out, so that I don't have to reline things up when I take it to my sewing machine. Let's get back to the sewing machine and sew this binding fabric on. It's helpful to place your machine on the table where you can drape the rest of the quilt on the tabletop so that you don't have to worry about the edges. For this part, make sure that you are stitching with a 1/4 inch seam allowance. I always start by stitching just a couple inches and verify everything before stitching around the whole edge of the quilt. So after stitching a couple inches, I take the quilt off the machine and I verify that the binding fabric folds all the way over the edge of the quilt and covers the seam that I just stitched the binding on with. And this looks great to me. Go ahead and keep on stitching, and I'll show you how to handle the corners of the quilt and how the binding will fold into place. When you get to the corner, you'll go ahead and stitch down the binding until you are a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt. Backstitch that spot so that it's tacked down nice and tight, and then cut your thread. And you can see here, I am about a 1/4 inch away from the edge. Next, fold the binding fabric away from the next edge of the quilt at a 45-degree angle, and then fold it down so that the binding edge lines up with the next edge of the quilt. Rotate the quilt, and starting right off at the edge of the quilt, stitch the binding down at a 1/4 inch seam allowance from the quilt edge, just like you did with the previous side, and be sure to backstitch this part. Let me stitch a little ways and I'll show you how the corner will fold over. Now you can see that this is how the corner binding fabric will fold over and then get hand sewn into place on the other side. Let's go ahead and get the rest of this binding fabric stitched down. When you get to the other end of the binding, leave yourself a good 12 to 15 inch gap between where you started sewing on the binding and where you finished sewing the binding. You'll need some wiggle room to attach the two ends of the binding, and we'll get to that shortly. By the way, the thread that you use for this part doesn't matter as long as it's regular strength and good thread, because these seams will be hidden by the end of the binding process. As you can see here, I have about a 13 inch gap between my binding start and stop points. Before we attach the tails of the binding fabric, we need to trim it and make it the exact length that we need to cover the edges of the quilt. So start by laying one tail of your binding fabric on the edge of your quilt, nice and flat, and trim it so that you're about 6 inches away from where your other binding tail's stitching starts. Now, lay your other tail on top of the first one so that they overlap. Basically, we need to trim the top tail so that the end of it exceeds past the bottom tail by 2 1/4 inches. The width of our binding is 2 1/4 inches, so this is a perfect little template on how far to cut. I like to place a straight pin into my quilt where the bottom tail stops, just so that I can see it really clearly. Now we can just go ahead and lay both pieces nice and flat, and then take the far end of the binding tail, Open it up so it isn't folded and line it up with a straight pin and then trim out the top binding tail. Be extra careful to only cut the top tail and not both of them or you'll be doomed. Just kidding, it's just not fun to fix it. As you can see here, my two tails overlap each other by 2¼ inches. Now remember all those 45-degree seams we did sew on our binding strips together? We are going to do the same thing here with a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and this time make sure to line up the corners of your binding tails exactly perpendicular, as in don't overlap them with excess fabric coming out of each side. Those corners should line up perfectly. I'm going to pin this first where the seam will go so that you can get an idea of how it will lay. It's helpful if you're new to this method to also pin it just to verify that you're going to sew it correctly. Everything looks good, so I'm going to turn my pin the opposite direction and get it ready to sew the actual seam that will attach these two ends together. Stitch across your pin, making a 45-degree seam, and then trim off the dog ears. And you can either get your iron and press the seam open, or you can just be lazy like me and finger press it. This means just push hard with your fingers until it lays flat. At this point, you should be able to lay your binding flat and pull your quilt tight, and the binding should just perfectly be the right length for the rest of your quilt's edge, where the binding still needs to be attached. Things look good here, and if your binding is too loose, that means you need to unpick the seam and sew it just a tiny bit more. And if your binding is now too tight, well, it shouldn't be if you did this right, but you'll need to add another little piece of binding fabric and try it again. Now we just have a little more ways to go sewing on the remainder of the binding fabric. And once you get completely back to your start point, you can just stitch right off the edge of the quilt. Let's go ahead and fold over the binding and grab a hand sewing needle. I like to use a needle that isn't too long but isn't too short either. We'll be taking about a 1/4 inch length stitches. I'll be stitching the binding down using silky 40-weight rayon. Go ahead and cut off a piece that's about 30 inches long, thread your needle, and grab both ends of the thread. Now we will do a thick knot in the ends of the thread. Start by putting your needle right through the batting and up into your binding seam. Your knot should stop you from pulling the thread all the way through the quilt. We want that knot to get stuck right in the batting layer. Since we are close to a corner, it's helpful to pin that corner down as we work our way towards it. To start stitching the binding, grab your needle and take a tiny little bite of your binding fabric. Then, through your quilt backing, careful not to go through the front of the quilt, and then take another little bite of the binding fabric's edge. You'll do this over and over again, with each stitch about 1/4 inch apart, to slowly pull the binding edge to the back of the quilt. Once you get the hang of this, you can stitch through the backing and the binding in one fell swoop, like so. When you get to the corner, place a stitch right where your pin was and then pull the pin out. At this point, we want to tie off the corner with a little double knot. This will secure all the stitches that you have done thus far and help our corner stay down as you start on the next edge of your binding. Once that's tacked down, fold over your other binding edge on the corner and start taking more 1/4 inch wide bites of the backing fabric, with little bites of the binding edge in between. This part might feel a little tedious, but for me it is honestly so therapeutic. And now you can start to see how the corners will look as you secure the binding fabric on the back. Another helpful tidbit is to use a bobby pin or two to tack down the binding as you go, just to get it into place so that you aren't constantly tugging on the binding fabric. I've heard that some people will even glue their binding down with Elmer's glue and then iron it and then do the hand stitching, but I haven't actually tried that technique myself, at least not yet. When you only have about 4 inches of thread left, it's time to tie this off and then get another strand. To do this, just take another bite of just the backing fabric and inevitably some of the batting, and then come back up through your backing between the edge and the binding seam. Then pull things nice and snug, and then tie a knot or two in your thread, including a little bite of the backing fabric as you tie the knot. Finally, you can bury the thread tail into the batting and trim off the excess. Your next thread strand will cover all of this and further secure things from coming undone. Grab another strand of thread and do it all over again until every inch of your binding fabric is sewn into place. You guys, we did it! We completed a quilt from the very start to the very end! Congratulations! Now go have a picnic and snuggle on it with someone you love.